Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mobbin coming at you with another APUSH video. This one focusing in on topic 4.11, taking a look at the age of reform in the Antebellum Era. And, so just kind of keep in mind that we kind of introduced this section, understand that this is happening at the same time as the rise of the Second Great Awakening, the rise of Transcendentalism, the rise of utopian societies. Same thing that's happening, politically is, the age of Andrew Jackson politically. Of course, we're still having issues with sectionalism and slavery. So all this is happening simultaneously for the United States in this kind of, antebellum era. And going back to themes like the Second Great Awakening and Transcendentalism and utopian societies, there is this growing sense in America of trying to make society better, to try to kind of, live up to these ideals of being good human beings in society that, that the Second Great Awakening and other, movements, have inspired in people. So keeping that in mind, this topic takes a look at many different areas of life socially that reformers wanted to improve upon. And it's basically the idea of identifying problems in society and coming up with ideas to solve them. Now, to some degree, this is going to involve government intervention. To some degree, it's not. In many respects, it'll parallel what will be a couple generations later, the progressive movement, for example. So with that being said, we're going to take a look at a few areas of reform, starting with the temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement's focus is trying to cure America of the scourge of alcohol, or as some might describe it, demon rum. The basic concern for folks in the temperance movement was the amount of alcohol that Americans were consuming at this point in history. And if you look at this graph right here, it kind of shows that, from the Revolutionary War era, it has spiked considerably. And what this was showing was by about 1830, 1835, the average American was consuming 5 whole gallons of pure grain alcohol in a year. So that is a lot of alcohol, and it's the highest to this date in American history. It was very common during this time period for a typical male to wake up, have a drink with breakfast, go to work, during a break at work, have a drink, go to have lunch with a beer or two, in the afternoon, maybe have a break with a drink, and come home and have a couple drinks with dinner. And that was seen as moderate drinking in those days. Today, we would certainly describe it as having more of an alcoholism issue. So alcohol was in many aspects of society all-consuming. And of course, there's grave concern as to what the results of alcoholism can do. And if you take a look at this cartoon, which is known as the Drunkard's Progress, it kind of shows this, cycle of, kind of getting introduced to alcohol at a young age. And, maybe it's something that you do very rarely, but maybe you find that it gives you a little bit more courage to talk to people, and maybe people of the opposite gender. And although there might be the occasional dust up because you're intoxicated, it's still, a good time, fun time. But over time, it is starting to wear on you physically. It is starting to wear on you financially. And, it basically over time breaks you down until you die. And it shows the message down here that when men, and almost always the focus of the concerns of alcohol was towards men being alcoholics, was that women and children, the dependents of these men, are going to be most affected by these decisions by men to engage in alcohol consumption, mass alcohol consumption. And this is going to explain also to some degree why so many women are going to be a part of the temperance movement, and why women are going to be kind of socially allowed to be a part of the temperance movement. So what is this going to eventually lead to in terms of policy moving forward? Well, as you can kind of see here, we're going to be seeing eventually a number of states that are going to be trying to ban alcohol. And as you can see here, starting with Maine in 1851, a number of states are going to start to ban alcohol consumption or create many limits on alcohol sales. Many counties in various states are going to limit alcohol sales or ban the consumption and sales outright. But note, this is going to be a bit divisive in America. Whereas Whigs tended to support the temperance movement, Democrats not as much. And a big divide on the alcohol issue were what were considered to be kind of native, waspy Americans that tended to be more in support of temperance versus more recent immigrant groups such as the Germans and the Irish that strongly opposed temperance in America. But note, this is going to be the early stage of what is going to be a slow, kind of slow movement throughout the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century that will eventually, by the 1920s, culminate in what will be the 18th Amendment, which will actually create alcohol prohibition in this country. Now, another area of focus for reformers is going to be the topic of dealing with those that are mentally ill and those that are criminals. And this is going to be most famously associated with the reformer Dorothea Dix. Now, what Ms. Dix is going to be focusing in on is the reality in, pre-antebellum times. The basic, kind of way of how things operated was that those that had mental health issues, folks that would be considered, mentally ill today, maybe engaging in issues, of psychosis to some degree, maybe suffering from schizophrenia or, a whole litany of mental health issues, they would be seen as dangers to society, because this is obviously a time where people didn't really know what these mental health issues were. They didn't know where they came from, and they certainly didn't know how to treat them. And so they just looked at these folks as scary and dangerous. And so the basic idea is, well, where do you put people that are scary and dangerous? Well, you put them in jail with criminals. And so that was generally what would happen, is that, those that were, in jail for all sorts of things, ranging from debtor, being in debt, to being a thief, to being a murderer perhaps, locked up in the same places with people that had legitimate mental health issues. And so reformers like Dorothea Dix are going to be focused on trying to change how this operates by, first off, separating the mentally ill from those that are criminals. So the idea being is that you take those that are mentally ill and you place them in an asylum. And an asylum in its classic definition means a safe place, a refuge, if you will. And so the idea being is that we're going to protect these folks that are suffering from problems of no fault of their own, and give them special attention and protect them from those that might, actually harm them, like serious hardened criminals. Then what do you do with the criminals? Well, that's another area of reform, and that is the idea of creating penitentiaries. Penitentiaries' root word is being penitent. And so the idea being is, kind of submitting to God, the idea of, focusing in on being a better person. And we're kind of reforming what prison means in the sense of taking prison away from solely being an institution that exists for punishment. Traditionally the idea is somebody commits a crime and justice is derived by punishment. You lock them up, you put them away, or you execute them, or whatever. It's punishment. That is justice, and that is what's best for society. Lock them up, throw away the key, you're punishing them. Well, what reformers were looking at is, what do you do with these folks that are criminals? The vast majority of criminals are not going to be sitting in jail forever. They're going to be coming back into society. So, if you just lock them away and forget about them for 10 years, and then they get released, well, there's a very good chance they're going to engage in that same kind of criminal behavior because they have no other way of living. They don't know any other way of living. So penitentiary reform is going to be focused on the idea of rehabilitating the criminal as opposed to simply punishing the criminal. And so the idea being is that through, education mixed in with some, religious teachings, job skills, stuff like that, showing accountability for one's actions, all those things kind of put together, that these folks that are today's criminals can be people tomorrow that are functional in society and people that you don't have to be afraid of, and fearful of. So be mindful of the reforms for the mentally ill and criminals led by Dorothea Dix. The other area of focus is going to be focusing in on education reform. Now, traditionally when we thought about education was not given a whole lot of attention nationwide. Now, more so in the North than in the South, but there really weren't a whole lot of rules about education. They didn't have licensing for teachers and for schools, and you just kind of found somebody that just said, yeah, okay, I'll be a teacher, and they had no training, no real knowledge of how to teach. And so, as you can imagine, education was pretty spotty across the country, and it wasn't just issues in terms of the quality of the teacher, but also funding for schools. Now, no, reformers are going to begin to change that. We're going to start to see, by the dawn of the Civil War, every state offering public education for, just about every student, at least, as long as they were white, as you can see here. And this is certainly going to be aiding in America's literacy rate, but it's going to be more to it than that. And a lot of that is attributed to the work of reformer Horace Mann. And Horace Mann, coming from Massachusetts, is seen as kind of the father of American education. And the idea being is that you must promote public education. You must promote access to education, because education is the pathway to social mobility. And this, in fact, was voiced by Jefferson, a generation earlier, that, America is a place of opportunity, but you can only have that opportunity really if you get an education. Without that education, you're going to be stuck in that cycle of poverty because you have no way out. But that education is going to give you more of an opportunity to transcend the class that you were born into in society. Secondly, education is going to be vitally important for America, in part because of the type of government that we operate with a democracy, a representative democracy, a republic. That means if the people are going to be having a voice in the educational process, or excuse me, if people are going to have a voice in the governing process, well, then they better darn well be educated. You cannot have ignorant people in charge of a government. That is a recipe for disaster. So if you believe in American values, if you believe in the American Republic, you've got to get folks educated. And, Horace Mann's going to be a major voice for this. Now, another important voice for this is going to be William McGuffey with his famous readers. And these are going to be, very small books that are going to be very common across America. They're going to be responsible for teaching millions of kids, basic skills, the 3 R's as they called it at the time, reading, writing, and arithmetic. But note, these readers also infuse other values other than just basic literacy. These readers and public education in general infuse, many Protestant, values, a strong work ethic, the idea of being sober, hard work, saving money, stuff like that. This is certainly a time where, there was no separation of church and state in public education. Religious values, religious teaching was infused with public education. And then also keep in mind that we are also seeing a rise in access for education for women, and a rise and increase in access to education at the collegiate level as well. So we are certainly modernizing education as we are going through, which is, obviously critically important in terms of improving society. We also saw the emergence of parochial schools for Catholic students. And, think about the reason why. As I said a moment ago, public education was not secular in nature like it is today. It was infused with religious values. But note, those are Protestant values. Well, if you're Catholic, you don't want your kids being raised with Protestant Christian values. You want your kids raised with Catholic Christian values. And so if the public schools won't do it, then you create your own schools. And that's where we get the origin of private parochial Catholic schools today. And many immigrants are going to be part of those schools as well. So we're going to leave it right there for today. Next time we'll talk about some other areas of American social life in the Antebellum Era. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.